Okay, so we've been talking about a number of the qualities of the poem, but let's actually start looking at the poem itself. And if you have your text, you can follow along with me. If you're dealing with a different translation, don't worry, they're close enough that you should be able to follow what I'm saying. Okay, so we begin the poem, and it says, "What we gardena in ye ardagum," and so forth. It may not say that, by the way, in your text, but this is how the poem begins. So, the Spirdanes in days gone by, and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard of, we have heard? The Old English word which is used here is actually a word which means to learn by hearing something. To learn by hearing something. So, once again, we have the kind of orality of an oral culture that I've been talking about. We're just going to see a whole bunch of these things. And I'll point some of them out, but you'll see these all over the place while you're reading the poem. So we have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns. There was Scyld Scefing, is what his name is in the original. Scourge of many tribes, a wrecker of mead benches. Remember I mentioned, and you've probably seen this if you've been reading along in the poem, that Heorot, the great hall built by Hrothgar in Denmark, it's called a mead hall. Well, what's mead? Anybody know what mead is? It's sorry? Did you press your button? Oh, you don't have one. Okay. Yes, it's fermented honey. And it's actually very much like a kind of ale, but they hadn't yet developed bittering. I don't know if any of you know anything about beer making or ale making and so forth. But starting in the 900s, there were some clever Germans who figured out that if you added hops to beer, that it would bitter it. And that's the kind of flavor that we have with beer, right? If you don't add hops to beer, what do you get? Anybody know? And what would it taste like? It's very, very sweet. Very sweet. It's very sugary, in fact. And it's the sugar that produces the alcohol in the beer. But anyway, then adding the hops bitters the beer. In England, they still talk about having a pint of bitter, right? Okay, so this is mead. This is an earlier version of beer or ale. And that's what people would do. They would come together in the hall and they would enjoy drinking the beer or drinking the mead together. And so they often refer to the hall as the mead hall, or the mead benches in the hall. A wrecker of mead benches, rampaging among foes, the terror of the hall troops had come far. A foundling to start with, Scyld Scefing was. A foundling to start with. His very origins are mysterious. Where does he come from? He would flourish later on as his powers waxed and his worth was proved. In the end, each clan on the outlying coasts beyond the whale road had to yield to him and begin to pay tribute. That was one good king, says Seamus Heaney. Actually, the original says, "That was god kinning." That was a good king. Okay, so notice in line 10, beyond the whale road, this is the first time we've seen something like this. This is a poetic figure, which in Old English is called a kenning. Let's see if we can go, whoops. Okay, it's a kenning. A kenning is a poetic figure which consists typically of two words put together to form a new kind of metaphorical figure. The whale road is one of the many kennings for the sea. A deer could be called a heath stepper, let's say. You know, sometimes the sea is referred to as the swan's road. And notice, if you chose the term whale's road over swan's road, what would you be suggesting? That in one case the sea is very stormy, tumultuous, strong. In another case, that the sea is very calm, gentle perhaps, like the swan, as in the Swan's Road. And notice that these kinds of poetic figures would have been available as a store of such figures to the poet. You might wonder, well, how do poets make up their poetry just on the spot, improvising, extemporaneously? Well, part of it is that in that kind of an oral poetic tradition, there are already existing patterns that the poet would have learned. And so you can take this pattern and put it in here, take that pattern and put it in there. And if the person is really skillful, the person can keep putting these patterns in where they're supposed to be as rapidly as the person composes the work. And once again, you know, the analogy in our time with rap music, you know, is pretty obvious, or with jazz in music and musical performance, which is all improvisational too. So, but the patterns already exist, don't they? I mean, the jazz musician is not making up all of the patterns as he or she is going along, though it may be a new combination of patterns, a quite original combination of patterns. Okay, so that was a good king. This is what a good king is. Somebody who is strong, and somebody who is heroic, and somebody who is able to rule not only over his own people, but also perhaps to rule over others as well. That's the way they think about it. Okay, so then he has a son whose name is Beo. In the original, by the way, it says Beowulf. But that always confuses people at first, because they think, wait a minute now, are there two Beowulfs here? Well, actually, there are two Beowulfs here. The Beowulf who's the hero of the poem is not this guy, and he won't come into the poem for another 100 lines or so. And notice that the famous son was Beo, who was known through the north, again through oral circulation of legends about him. And a young prince must be prudent like that, giving freely. See, once again, giving, that's what the leader does. The leader gives of whatever he has, while his father lives, so that afterward, in age when fighting starts, steadfast companions will stand by him and hold the line. Right? Now that's the comitatus. You see, here's the smart young leader who is giving of whatever wealth he has to followers, so that when he becomes the leader himself after his father dies, then he already is going to have a loyal following. That's the comitatus. And then notice what the poet says. Behavior that's admired is the path to power among people everywhere. Okay, well then, Scyld dies in the natural course of things. And so what do we have? We have a ship burial. Notice that Beowulf begins and ends with burials. Beowulf's funeral at the end and his cremation and burial in a burial mound. The poem begins with Scyld, now, who is the ancestor of the Danes whom we actually meet in the poem, and we have his funeral. But his funeral is a ship burial. Now we know that ship burials took place either actually or symbolically all over the northern world. One of the most famous of these is, if we can go back here now, take away Kenning, is at a place called, a place called Sutton Hoo. Sutton Hoo. That is in the southeastern part of England. And what happened in 1939 was that there were some people doing some excavations, and as I recall, it was to put in water pipes and sewage lines and so forth. And the workmen ran into this stuff in the earth, and they called the woman who owned the property, and she came over and she realized that it must be something very ancient and also very important. And so she called the guy from the local museum, who came out and realized not only that it was very important and very valuable, but that it was beyond his abilities to deal with. So he called the British Museum, and they sent people from London. They started doing the excavations, and what they discovered was a ship burial, which went back to Anglo-Saxon times. It went back to the middle of the 600s. And then, by the way, World War II, and it's 1939, right? World War II started, and you know, of course, there was the Battle of Britain, and the Germans were sending over their bombers almost daily and nightly in bombing all over the place. And so they were afraid that this was going to get destroyed, so what they did was they just filled it all in. Just filled the excavation back in with dirt so that it wouldn't be disturbed even if there were a bomb blast nearby. And then after the war, this is one of the first things that they did, was they went and re-excavated the area. Now all of these artifacts are available in the British Museum and the British Library. And if you get to London at some point, you know, in the near future, or the far future for that matter, go up to the second floor and look for the Sutton Hoo exhibit. It is absolutely amazing, the stuff that they recovered. And it bears a very close resemblance to the kind of stuff that we find in Beowulf, which is very interesting. Okay, so here we have a ship burial. But this is literally by putting the guy who has died and a bunch of treasures into a ship and then pushing the ship out when the tide is going out so that it will carry the ship out to sea. And as the poet says, no one knows whatever happened to that ship or its load. So just as we don't know where Scyld came from in the first place, he was a foundling, remember, we don't know where he has gone into the future either. Now that's a kind of thing that you could find in a poem before the coming of Christianity. But at other points we're going to see very clear Christian references. Well, in any event, we have a description of all the precious stuff that is put in the boat with him. This is a ship well furnished with battle tackle, bladed weapons, coats of mail, massed treasure was loaded on top of him, on top of Scyld's dead body. It would travel far, go out into the ocean's sway. They decked his body no less bountifully with offerings than those first ones did who cast him away when he was a child and launched him alone out over the waves. And they set a gold standard up high above his head and let him drift to wind and tide, bewailing him and mourning their loss. Well, you look at the materials from the Sutton Hoo ship burial, and that's the stuff you see on display now in the British Museum. Very, very interesting and beautiful stuff. Well, we move along then, and we find that Beo, the son, now is the king, and he's well regarded. And then he has a son, the great Halfdane, as he's called here in Seamus Heaney's translation, who has 4 children: Harogar, Hrothgar, the good Halga, and a daughter who was Onela's queen. Okay, and notice, by the way, he keeps referring to things like, I have heard this, I've learned this by hearing that, and so forth. All the way through here, he's making those kinds of references to hearing these stories being told. Okay, so moving right along here, we then find, this is in lines 64 and following, we then find that Hrothgar, having been very successful in battles and whatnot, decides that he is going to build a great hall. And this is going to be his great mead hall, where he's going to gather all of his people together. And by the way, people would live in these halls in very close proximity to one another, so that they not only ate and drank in the halls, but then they would sleep in the halls as well. And this is as good a point as any for me to make a point that I always make in these courses, is that people in these earlier times, and of course many people in our time elsewhere in the world, really did not have the luxury of privacy that many of us enjoy. I mean, we think of privacy in terms of having our own space, right? And where you live, if you can and your family can afford it, you want to have your own room, right? And if you can, maybe even your own bathroom. Well, that's just non-existent for most people in the history of humanity on this planet, right? I mean, even today, most people don't have the luxury of that kind of private space for themselves. And certainly back then, they did not. So that if you go into even some of the early castles, I'm not talking about those things that were built much later on, but I'm talking about the early medieval castles. And what you find are these large spaces where you would have 200 or 300 people living, men, women, children living, all in a common area. You might find, I'm thinking about one in particular, you might find, and this was the case in this particular early castle, there were 4 private rooms. Now guess who got one of the private rooms? You know, of all the people who were living in the castle. Obviously the people who were at the top, right? The king and queen, or the duke and duchess, and that sort of thing. They would perhaps have their own private quarters. But everybody else would be living in common areas. And as best as we can tell, what they would do is they would put up some sort of divider to say, well, this is my space over here. You know, and that's your space over there. But those things would all be taken down, and the bedding would be put into closets during the daytime, because they would be using exactly the same space for other activities during the daytime, including eating and drinking and having meetings and so forth. So privacy, as you and I think of it, just didn't exist. Even things like toilet facilities were relatively public. Bathing was in general a public activity for people throughout most of the Middle Ages, except for the few people who were wealthy enough to be able to have their own private quarters. So that, I mean, I'm thinking right now of one manuscript illumination in which you have these wealthy, noble people on their horses and dressed up in their finery and so forth. And then in the background, you have just the ordinary people who are clearly bathing. They're swimming around, men and women together, nude in a pond. Apparently, this is such a commonplace that the noble figures aren't even taking note of it. Right? Well, of course, I mean, you have to bathe, right? So how are you going to bathe? So what I'm getting at is that our conception of what it means to be an individual is to a large extent predicated on and formed by our experience of privacy and of private space. But what if you live in a culture in which you don't have privacy in our sense of privacy? Then notice you have all of your experience in common space, and your sense of yourself as an individual is going to be different from the one that we cultivate in our culture, right? I mean, people think of themselves much more in terms of being members of a common group, rather than I'm an individual, you're an individual, so-and-so's an individual, there's another individual, and so forth. It's not that they don't see themselves as individuals. They just do so in a very different way than in our kind of culture. Okay, so here we have then the king doling out rings and torques at the table after the hall has been built. This is to all of the people who have helped him with the building of the great hall. So once again, the giving of gifts and the importance placed on that. But of course, Heorot is attacked by a powerful demon, a prowler through the dark, who nursed a large grievance. It harrowed him to hear the din of the loud banquet every day in the hall, the harp being struck, and the clear song of a skilled poet. That would be a shop. Telling with mastery of man's beginnings how the Almighty had made the earth, a gleaming plain girdled with waters. In his splendor he, that is to say the Almighty, set the sun and the moon to be earth's lamplight, lanterns for men, and filled the broad lap of the world with branches and leaves, and quickened life in every other thing that moved. What does that sound like? That song of the shop. Hint, hint, that we have read in this course. Doesn't that sound like Cadman's hymn? Okay, who also was a shop. He came to it late in life, and by a miracle, but he became a shop. So also this guy is singing a song of creation, based on the same kind of biblical narrative as Cadman's hymn. Notice this is clearly a Christian reference, isn't it? I mean, it's to the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament, but nevertheless, it was because of the coming of Christianity into England by this time. Okay, so notice how we're getting different elements here. Some of them surviving from pre-Christian times, some of them being very clearly Christian and therefore newer elements within this culture, with the effort to bring these together in a new kind of cultural combination. So times were pleasant for the people there, until finally one, a fiend out of hell, See, Grendel is already furious because of the light and gaiety of the court, or the hall, the mead hall. And this is Grendel. Grendel was the name of this grim demon, haunting the marches, marauding around the heath and the desolate fens. He had dwelt for a time in misery among the banished monsters. Cain, as in Cain of the biblical story of Abel and Cain, Cain's clan. These are the cursed ones, the kin of Cain, who was cursed because he had killed his own brother, whom the Creator had outlawed and condemned as outcasts. For the killing of Abel, the eternal Lord had exacted a price. Cain got no good from committing that murder, because the Almighty made him anathema, and out of the curse of his exile there sprang, guess what? Ogres and elves and evil phantoms, and the giants too, who strove with God time and again until he gave them their reward. Now it's interesting how these things are all mixed in together. Elves, ogres, giants. I mean, these are all out of Old Norse mythology, as Tolkien would have pointed out. These are all figures out of Old Norse mythology. But notice now they have been brought into the biblical narrative of what happened to the kin of Cain. There's another work which I'm thinking of, which is not contemporaneous with Beowulf, but it was written sometime after that, but still in the Middle Ages, in which the origin of such figures is attributed to the fallen angels. The fallen angels, the ones who warred against God. Here are the giants. The giants warred against God? What are we talking about? The giants war against the gods in Norse mythology. Okay? But we don't have that in the Bible, say. So again, notice that different elements from different religious cultures are being brought into alignment with one another. Okay, so then, of course, here comes Grendel. He comes bursting into the hall, knocks the door off of its hinges, in fact, and he grabbed 30 men. 30 men. And there's an element, because Grendel is human-like. He's not human, but he's human-like. There's therefore an element of something close to cannibalism in his gobbling up the people, or at least parts of the people whom he slaughters. And of course, as any anthropologist can point out to you, this is one of the most horrifying things in world cultures generally. Stories about cannibals and cannibalism. So. And then as dawn brightened and the day broke, Grendel's powers of destruction were plain. Their wassail was over. The drink. Wassail. You know, we still drink that around Christmas time and New Year's. Their wassail was over. They wept to heaven and mourned under mourning. Their mighty prince, their storied leader, sat stricken and helpless, humiliated by the loss of his guard, and so forth. Notice that part of the suffering is the humiliation of the leader, who is not able to protect his followers. So, then we have the spread of the legend. This is down, in 144 and following. Grendel ruled in defiance of right, one against all, until the greatest house in the world stood empty, a deserted wallstead, for 12 winters, seasons of woe. The Lord of the Scyldings suffered under his load of sorrow. For 12 long years, this went on. Well, the news then was known all over the world. Again, oral circulation. It's not through newspapers. It's through oral circulation. People are constantly in the north crisscrossing the sea from one place to another, to another, to another, and that's how news gets spread around, by word of mouth. And then in line 164 and following, so Grendel waged his lonely war, inflicting constant cruelties on the people, atrocious hurt. He took over Heorot, haunted the glittering hall after dark. But the throne itself, the treasure seat, he was kept from approaching. He was the Lord's outcast. Now, a lot of people have pondered and puzzled over those lines. What does that mean? The throne itself, the treasure seat. In the Old English original, that's called a gift stall. The gift seat, that is to say, the seat that the king would sit on while he was giving out gifts to his followers. And notice that alone is the place that Grendel cannot touch. What does that mean? Does it mean that there's something magical about it? Some sort of power that it has? And what might that be? And of course, there are a lot of things like this in Beowulf that people will think, aha, maybe that goes back to some even earlier myth or legend or magical belief. Who knows? We only have these little hints of things from time to time. These were hard times. And then notice, what do the people do? They're trying to figure how to resist Grendel. So in 175 and following, sometimes at pagan shrines, they vowed offerings to idols. Notice, not to gods, but to idols, from a Christian point of view. To idols, swore oaths that the killer of souls, the devil, might come to their aid and save the people. By the way, it's a commonplace in early Christian writings that the devil is not only the killer of souls, but also that idols are devils, themselves devils. And worship in pagan shrines is really devil worship. That comes up over and over and over again. That was their way. Notice that the poet then appears to be coming from a Christian culture, doesn't he? Not only can he make references to the Christian Bible, but also he can talk about these people of the past as of the past, of the pre-Christian past. That was their way, their heathenish hope. Deep in their hearts, they remembered hell. Not remembered in the sense of our sense of remembered, but brought to mind hell. The Almighty Judge of good deeds and bad, the Lord God, head of the heavens and high King of the world, was unknown to them. Was unknown to them. Oh, cursed is he who in time of trouble has to thrust his soul into the fire's embrace. Hell? Hell's embrace? Forfeiting help. He has nowhere to turn. But, blessed is he who after death can approach the Lord and find friendship in the Father's embrace. Okay? Just as the wanderer used to find comfort and safety in the embrace of his earthly Lord until his earthly Lord died. And then he was forced to become a wanderer. So notice, by the way, that the same characterization or the same kind of figure, which in one case might be used by people who are not Christians, can now be taken over and be used for a Christian purpose. by somebody in the new culture. Well, then of course we have the hero coming to Heorot. We have Beowulf, who in line 194 hears about Grendel as the news comes from Denmark to Sweden, the land of the Geats. Once again, oral tradition, oral circulation of these stories. And notice that the elders and the wise counselors don't try to dissuade Beowulf from going to help Hrothgar rid Heorot of Grendel. They inspect omens, which is interesting, in 204. It's like one of the things among these peoples of the north that they used to do was cast runes. Remember I mentioned that there was a kind of writing system which was called runic, based on the runes. Runes were like letters, except they were stick-like figures, and apparently originally they were sticks that were tied together in one way or another. And they had a kind of magical power, so that what you would do is you would cast the runes, and then somebody who was adept in reading the runes would say, the pattern here is such and such, so that they could forecast the future, let's say. Okay, so they're inspecting omens. But then, of course, Beowulf and his men go on their sea voyage from Sweden to Denmark. And apparently things go very well. They get to the coast of Denmark, and they are approached by the Danish Coast Guard. Who's not all alone. We find out a few lines later that he actually has a number of other warriors or soldiers with him. Yeah, do you have a question?
Yeah, were we supposed to think that Hrothgar, like, that they were a Christian this whole time, or they're kind of one of those nations that go back and forth? Because it doesn't really say that they become Christian, it just says that Beowulf is later on.
Yeah, see, the poet and the poem are not totally consistent. Most of the time we have an indication that while the poet appears to be Christian, because otherwise how could the poet make all these Christian references? While the poet is Christian, that doesn't mean that the characters in the poem are Christians. But where that gets a little slippery is the point at which Hrothgar is giving a speech to Beowulf. This is after Beowulf's victory. And it sounds an awful lot like a kind of Christian speech or even Christian sermon coming out of the mouth of somebody who's not really supposed to be a Christian. So there are, questions of consistency like that. But those things only really occur to us in our kind of culture, where we can sit down with a book and we can question this word and that phrasing and this passage, or that character is depicted in a certain way. That kind of analytical approach to a text requires that we have a text to analyze. Whereas in an oral performance, things that are relatively small, quote, inconsistencies may not appear to the audience to be inconsistent at all, unless they go against the traditional versions of the story in some way. One of the things that happens in oral tradition, and there are scholars in the field of folklore who study this, even in our own time. And one of the things that you will find is when people are traditional storytellers, say in rural communities, though they don't have to be rural communities, is that if the person tells the story in a way that goes against the tradition, the audience will respond and say, that's not the way it goes. The same thing is true with children. I know when my children were small, their favorite story was Beowulf. I used to perform Beowulf for them at different times. And every once in a while, I would vary some of the characters or some of the actions or some of the descriptions. And they'd stop me and they say, "No, Dad, that's not the way it goes. The way it goes is," and then they would say exactly what I had said on earlier occasions. That's how oral tradition tends to work. So that you might say, well, why don't things just constantly get changed? Because the audience won't stand still for that. The audience wants the traditional story. Now, they'll allow some innovation in the story, but there are limits to what the audience may allow. So that imposes a kind of consistency on the tellings of the story, but it's not a total consistency. Okay, so, I mean, did I answer your question? Yeah, okay, good. And the Danish Coast Guard has the job of checking up on people who come up to the coast. I mean, you just don't let foreigners, especially armed foreigners whom you don't know, and you don't know what their intentions are, come into your land. And so his job is to challenge anybody who comes to the coastline, which is what he does. And he says, okay, who are you guys and what are you doing here? And he says, among other things, that he notes that there is a leader who appears to be more noble than anybody else he has ever seen before. And so then we have the leader of the troop in line 258 and following, unlocking his word hoard. This is one of those formulaic expressions that I was talking about. Remember when I said that there were patterns that the poet could draw on? One of them is that speaking could be referred to poetically as unlocking one's word hoard. And a word hoard is itself a kenning. Remember the kenning? What a kenning is? It's a kind of metaphor where you take two words and you put them together into a new word. A word hoard. A hoard is like a hoard of treasure, right? Well, you and I have word hoards in a sense, right? We have a treasure house of language that we can draw on if we see fit. Okay, so he unlocked his word hoard. And what does he say? We belong by birth to the Geat people and owe allegiance to Lord Hioak, who would be the king, or kinning in Old English. In his day, my father was a famous man, a noble warrior lord named Ecgtheow. Notice how frequently people are referred to by their father's names or even sometimes by their grandfather's names. Because your identity derives from your parents. By the way, among the Scandinavians, people are typically referred to as like John Johnson, you know, or Frank Johnson or whatever it might be, son of John. I mean, that's where those names come from. And they're very, very common among the Scandinavian peoples. One time when I was in Reykjavik, which is the capital city of Iceland, I was trying to look up a guy whom I had known here, by the way, when he was an exchange student over here, and I was trying to get back into touch with him over there. He was an Icelander. And so I picked up the telephone directory, and everybody's name is listed by their first name, not by what we call a last name, but by their first name, which is very interesting if you're trying to find somebody. So anyway, here we have Beowulf not giving his own name, but identifying himself with his father's name and with his chieftain's name. And then he talks about his about his father. He outlasted many a long winter and went on his way. Went on his way is a euphemism for dying. Like we say passed away sometimes as a euphemism for dying. All over the world, men wise in counsel continue to remember him. We come in good faith to find your Lord. Okay? How you are thought of and how you are remembered is your immortality for these people. And that is extremely important, just as it is in Homer. Kleos is the Greek word that Homer and other ancient Greeks use for your reputation, your good reputation. You can have bad reputation, but what you aspire to is having fame, which means a good reputation. Okay? We come in good faith to find your Lord, and nations shield the son of Halfdane. Give us the right advice and direction. We have arrived here on a great errand to the Lord of the Danes, and I believe, therefore, there should be nothing hidden or withheld between us, etc. So, finally, the Coast Guard is going to be, more or less secure in the belief that these people mean no harm and should be brought to the court of Hrothgar. And so they went on their way. This is in 301 and following. The ship rode the water, broad-beamed, bound by its hawser, and anchored fast. Okay? And what are these people wearing? Boar shapes flashed above their cheek guards. They're wearing helmets. One of these, by the way, survives from Sutton Hoo, and you can actually see this in the British Museum. And it comes up kind of to a point like this. By the way, no self-respecting Scandinavian would have worn those things with horns. Why? Because notice it becomes a perfect guide for somebody's axe or sword to come down between and slice you in half, or slice your head in half at least. And so they had pointed helmets. And then on the cheeks, they had decorations. And here we have the decorations of the images of boars, just like on the Sutton Hoo helmet, by the way. There seems to be something perhaps totemic about that. Totemic in the sense that there's an association between the animal and the people who wear the image of the animal. It's not exactly that they believe that they're descended from the animal, so much as it appears that they want to appropriate the qualities of the animal. And a boar is a very dangerous, very savage beast. And so it would be an appropriate image for a warrior to adopt and to wear as part of his war gear, along with his mail shirt, which is not the sheet metal, but that the interlocking ringed mail. That's the kind of armor that people wore throughout the Middle Ages until the tail end of the Middle Ages in the 15th century, when they began to adopt heavier armor because of heavier weaponry being used against them. And so we come to the end of our discussion in this hour, and we'll continue next time.